Hello and welcome back to another How to Paint series of videos. Today we're going to be looking at probably my favorite model out of all of 40K, one of them at least. We're going to be looking at the Redemptor Dreadnought. This is a absolute unit of a model. It took very long to build. I think it's something like 130 pieces. And hopefully at the end we'll have something that looks a little bit more like this. We're actually going to be doing Dark Angels though, so imagine this, but green, right? By the way, I just want to say before we start, get the push fit models. They are so much quicker to build. Unfortunately, they are monopose, but it's like 30 parts opposed to 130. So, do what you will with that information. And as always, we're going to be starting with a nice layer of surface primer, Vallejo. This stuff is very cheap compared to the usage you'll get out of it. Just peek my microphone there a little bit, don't worry too much about it. And we're going to be going ahead and jumping right in. I unfortunately don't have Old Reliable today, but I do have a somewhat bigger brush, just for the bigger model we have. We're going to go ahead and just kind of, not very carefully, but liberally apply this all over our model, kind of everywhere we can reach and everything we can see. We might need to switch to a smaller brush for certain areas, but we'll do our best. And I'm not sure how well it'll kind of work after we've applied our first layer here, but this kind of front piece does lift up a little bit. The bottom piece is also meant to lift up, but unfortunately in my process of putting it together I managed to glue it, otherwise it just would not stay on. So that is something that you need to be careful of if you assemble one of these yourself. I also would like to point out that a few different areas, I'm not sure if it was unique to me, but this whole thing was kind of a nightmare to put together. And I'll kind of showcase it as we go along here. Again, not too much of a concern about how neat we are. We're just getting as much coverage as we can, kind of as quickly as we can here. And you want to make sure to get in all of your cracks and crevices. This is our most important layer because it's basically what all of your paint is going to be adhering to. It's not doing much for your kind of shading. That's going to be our next layer, which is going to be Abaddon Black. But it is just a good foundation, so you want to make sure you cover as much as possible, kind of as well as you can. Don't worry about it looking splotchy. It's not going to be noticeable in our finished product. And actually by our kind of first and second layers, it's not going to be noticeable at all. We'll have gone over it so much. And don't worry about thinning it if you're using the same type of thinner, sorry, not thinner, primer that I'm using. This is already pretty thin. It's meant for airbrushes. It does work just fine with normal brushes. It's actually kind of why I prefer it. It's already thinned down quite a bit. You just want to kind of be careful of how much you get on your brush at a time. You'll find that you kind of end up applying too much to a certain area, and that can give kind of the same result as being too thick. And you'll see we're applying this very quickly, and that's perfect. That's what we want. Doesn't have to be fancy, we just need full coverage. This is actually kind of a start of my Dark Angels army. I have a couple of 30K models, but I just picked up the Combat Patrol as well as this unit, obviously. And hopefully, I don't want to go like too deep into Dark Angels, but I do want a pretty sizable force, just kind of give me something different to paint for a while. If you've watched any of my other videos, and obviously by the Dreadnought we already have, you can tell that I'm a Ultramarines fan. I'm very excited for Space Marine 2. That comes out in, I think, less than 2 weeks now. I'm not sure, so I think the release date is the 9th of this month. But there's also like an early access thing if you pre-order it. So I'm not sure if that's the 9th with the early access or if it's just coming out on the 9th altogether. So we'll see. And generally I don't like pre-orders, but good lord, I'm gonna get it anyway, I might as well pre-order, right? It's kind of my logic on it. There was kind of a early release that I think just got leaked. And from what I've seen, I haven't watched too much of it just to not spoil myself, but the gameplay looks pretty good. The kind of cinematics and everything looks solid. I'm very excited for it. And you'll have to forgive my weird angles here. This is a very hefty model, and I gotta turn it all sorts of ways to get the coverage I want. And we're moving on to the other arm here. There's a couple of different build options with this guy. I went with the plasma gun because we're doing Dark Angels, but if you're doing something like, I don't know, Space Wolves, I think there's also a Gatling gun you can apply to this guy instead. I don't really play the tabletop too much, so I'm not focused on like what's meta or you know what has better stats. But if you want to do that route, you can always use magnets, and you know you can switch out your options. Just a little bit more work for a already very lengthy build process though, so I'm not going to do that. And I just want to kind of do a final check here. It looks like we got most of our guy pretty well. Actually, I think so I do think I installed the gun on top backwards. That's okay. I'll try to take it off and fix it, you know, in between parts. But that's something I just realized. I'm sure there's already someone in the comments trying to tell me, but that's all right. We all make mistakes. That's how we learn, right? And again, you don't need perfect coverage. It's going to look splotchy. It's a very quick kind of first layer, and that's the point. And I think that's just about everything. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our second layer here once we wash our brush off. Just do one more quick little visual check. I always miss something, I swear. And actually, I found it already. Thankfully, I'm not, you know, halfway into the next layer before I found it, but there's a little bit of underarm area that I missed. And actually I missed it on both sides. It's very hard to kind of get into though, so it's a little bit excusable. And as always, this kind of applies more to the later layers, but if you can't see part of your model, it usually means that it's not going to be visible once it's fully painted. Unless someone is like really looking for all the little mistakes you've made. So don't worry too much about missing kind of the darker shadowy areas. We're going to do a layer of Abaddon Black, and that's kind of going to hide a lot of the spots that are hard to reach. And unfortunately this brush holds a lot of paint, so I really have to kind of wash it off here. Don't worry too much about that. And we're going to be moving on to our Abaddon Black. This is our base layer. You can do gray if you want, or a white. You just want a kind of solid layer on top of your primer to start with before you go on to what's going to be your base layer. Because not only does it help with shadows, but it also helps, you know, kind of make sure that you've covered everything, right? It's one thing to look and see that you have primer somewhere just exposed, but it's another thing altogether if you just have you know, black or like a solid gray. It's a lot more excusable. And unfortunately I think I watered this down just a little bit too much. Try it again here. There we go. It's still a little bit watery, but that's fine. We're going to be doing multiple layers. And once you apply a layer, try not to brush over it too much. It'll kind of give you weird brush strokes once it's all said and done. So if it looks, you know, splotchy, just let it dry and then go back over it. Don't go over it while it's still drying. And again, we don't have to be very clean or precise with this. We just want to cover as much as we can, kind of as quickly as we can. I actually think, I probably mentioned this already, But Dreadnoughts are like my favorite unit. I think they look the coolest. They kind of have the coolest lore. But it's one of those things where it's a weird point in the lore because it's like, why don't they make more of them, right? And I think it's the same thing with like the Terminator armor. They just chalk it up to being like more difficult to produce. But there's a section in, I believe it's the book, The Battle for the Abyss, where, and obviously it's, 30k. I just hit my lamp. It's 30k, so obviously they could produce stuff a little bit more easily. But they talk about, they have like an entire room on their ship. I think it's part of the armory. And it's just full of like Dreadnought chassis, just waiting for wounded Marines. And I don't want to spoil any of the book or anything if you haven't read it, but essentially it's a, I believe, word bearer's ship, and they're going to assault, I believe it's Kolth. It's one of the Ultramarines worlds, so they're like expecting tons of losses, and that's the whole reason why they have a whole ship, full of these dreadnoughts. But it really begs the question: it's like, why don't they do that, with every huge battle? The drop site massacre. I feel like that would have been a good time. But that's too much logic into it, and foreshadowing and hindsight and all that. But it's something that just kind of irks me with the lore. Otherwise, it's great. I love Dreadnoughts. They're my favorite. They just have such a kind of iconic design to them, especially the older kind of box knots. Unfortunately, I do not have any in my collection, but man, they are super cool. I really like them. And as always, I did not put nearly enough paint on my palette, so we gotta fill up a little bit. One area that you do want to be careful with, specifically with the plasma gun here, maybe you guys aren't using that, but you want to be careful not to get the coils, and I already kind of didn't take my own advice and did it anyway. But the coils are going to be a much brighter color, so I'm going to be trying to not get any black on that if I can. We're actually going to be doing that probably with a nice coat of white afterwards. And we'll be doing a little bit of dry brushing with this as well in the later parts. And the base, I'm not sure if we'll get to it in this series. I kind of want to do a whole separate video just on basing alone. I have a couple of different ideas for the base. Normally I'm just lazy and I use Sterling Mud, but I'm thinking I want to do kind of the other technical paints in the GW line. I think it's called like Martian Iron Earth or something. It's like a kind of Mars, like orangey paint, but it's a crackle paint, I believe they're called. And it's a really weird effect. I don't know how to describe it. But just kind of look up, if you're curious, the Games Workshop kind of line of paints, the technical paints. There's a lot of really cool effects that you can get with them that they're meant for, and I want to try something like that. I do unfortunately still have to order it, so again, it might not be in this series, but at some point we will do a entire just video entirely on basing. Maybe once we get the Combat Patrol finished, we'll go through and we'll do this model, and we'll do a couple of the other ones from that, and we'll just do all of the bases in one go. And again, we want to make sure we get all of those hard-to-reach areas. That's basically 90% of this model, unfortunately. And get a little bit more water in our brush. Again, it's always a constant balancing act of too thin versus too thick for your paint. Especially with bigger models like these, you're constantly having to refill your palette and reload your brush. You're just going to be constantly going back and forth between putting more water on and putting more paint on. Make sure we get these exhaust ports. And I'll let that dry real quick. I'm not sure if we'll be able to lift this kind of front piece still. The paint might have dried and put it in a kind of stationary position, but that's okay. I really don't have any plans to open that front piece anyway. It just kind of helps paint the underside if we still can. And I don't know if I'll really be able to get underneath these shoulders too well, unfortunately. I might have to switch to a smaller brush at some point just to do that. And we're kind of getting to the point now where I'm just going back over everything I've already gone over. So we're almost finished up with this layer. Again, don't worry about getting a perfect kind of solid layer. Having it be splotchy, especially with the black, again, this is our shading layer, kind of helps give like a natural kind of shading effect with very little effort. And we'll be doing some dry brushing later to kind of accentuate that. The nice thing about the Dreadnoughts is their armor panels are nice and big, so we can actually do edge highlighting with a dry brush instead of having to use any kind of like wet paint like you normally would. So we might actually do a little bit of that too, kind of closer to the end. And I missed the feet a little bit. That's okay. Unfortunately, they are kind of glued weird as well. Some of the little flaps here are sticking up, but that's okay. Hopefully once we do the paste and everything, it'll look kind of more natural. Maybe we'll fill up kind of the area underneath it with something. Make it look like he's maybe standing on like a rock. And getting into a real weird spot here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, right underneath that shoulder. And I'm just trying to think of the best way to go about doing that. And we'll come around. This gun on top really doesn't like paint for some reason. There we are. And looking over this one last time, minus this other weird spot, I don't know if I can even reach that. It's right back here. Again, if you can't really see it easily, don't worry too much about it. It just means that other people won't see it easily either. And there we are. That's pretty much going to be it for our primer layer and our kind of follow-up shade layer. Next time we're going to come back, we are going to do our main base layer, which is going to be, sneak peek, Caliban green. And depending on how long that takes us, we might even start with kind of doing the smaller details. I'm really excited to do the plasma gun, specifically. The coils are really fun. We'll do some layer paint and kind of some glazes with that. And I don't know, maybe we'll even start dry brushing. It kind of depends on how long that takes us. So if you enjoyed this, I do have a Patreon. The link is in the description. Other than that, I really appreciate you guys liking and commenting, subscribing as well, obviously. And, that's really all I can ask from you guys. Other than that, please join me in the next episode. And thank you very much for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you next time.